Have you ever wondered if there are contradictions in the Bible? A question that many have pondered upon, turning pages, seeking answers, and finding more questions. What if I told you that these seeming contradictions are not contradictions at all, true or false? Our journey today is not one of doubt, but of understanding. It's about peeling back the layers, seeking context, and discovering the richness of interpretation of the Holy Bible. The Bible, a millennia-old book, is not just a collection of verses, but a tapestry of narratives, laws, prophecies, and wisdom. It's a book that speaks to the human condition in its entirety, in all its complexity. So, what about those verses that seem to contradict each other? Can they all be true? Can they coexist without undermining the credibility of this sacred text? Today, we will look into this question and explore the context and interpretation of seemingly contradictory verses. Consider the account of creation in Genesis. Some argue that there are two conflicting versions. Indeed, at first glance, it seems that Genesis chapters 1 and 2 present differing accounts of creation. Chapter 1 outlines a sequential 7-day creation process, while chapter 2 appears to suggest a different order. Let's delve a little deeper. Genesis 1, with its rhythmic "and there was evening and there was morning" refrain, presents a broad, cosmic view of creation. It's as if we're watching a grand orchestra, each section playing its part in harmony, culminating in the creation of humanity on the 6th day. In contrast, Genesis 2 zooms in for a close-up, focusing on the creation of the first man and woman. It's like a poignant solo performance within the larger symphony. It doesn't aim to retell the sequence of creation, but instead offers a detailed look at the relationship between God and the first humans. Now, some point to specific details, like the creation of animals, which seems to occur after the creation of Adam in chapter 2, contradicting the order in chapter 1. But notice the subtle language used in the original Hebrew text. It can be interpreted as God had formed the animals, suggesting a past event, not a new act of creation. So, are these two accounts contradictory? Not when we appreciate their unique perspectives and purposes. Genesis 1 gives us the big picture, the grand narrative of creation, while Genesis 2 provides an intimate portrait of humanity's special relationship with God. The beauty of these accounts lies not in their sameness, but in their complementarity. Like two sides of a coin, they offer a fuller, richer understanding of the same event. They remind us that the divine narrative is multi-layered, filled with depth and complexity, inviting us to delve deeper and seek understanding. But when we understand the context, we see these are not contradictions, but different perspectives on the same event. Another seemingly contradictory verse is in the book of Matthew and Mark regarding the death of Judas. Judas Iscariot, infamously known as the one who betrayed Jesus, met his end in a rather grim fashion. However, the accounts of his death in the books of Matthew and Mark appear to differ, creating an apparent contradiction. In the book of Matthew, it is written that Judas, filled with remorse, returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders before hanging himself. The chief priests then used the money to buy a potter's field as a burial place for foreigners, hence it was called the Field of Blood. On the other hand, the book of Mark does not provide a direct account of Judas's death. Instead, in the book of Acts, it is described that Judas bought a field. With the reward of his wickedness, fell headlong, his body burst open, and all his intestines spilled out. This event gave the field its name, the Field of Blood. At first glance, these accounts seem to contradict each other. One says Judas hanged himself, while the other describes his death in a more gruesome manner. And who really bought the field? Was it the chief priests or Judas himself? Here's where understanding the context and cultural nuances of the biblical era comes into play. The Jewish law prohibited the temple treasury from accepting money tainted by blood. Thus, the chief priests could not put the money back into the treasury and decided to use it to buy a field for the burial of foreigners. As for Judas's death, it's plausible that he hanged himself, and later his body fell and burst open, creating the horrific scene described in Acts. In essence, both accounts could be describing the same series of events from different perspectives. Again, understanding the context allows us to reconcile these two accounts. Let's look at another instance in the books of Samuel and Chronicles, where the number of fighting men in Israel differs. In the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 24, verse 9, it is written that Israel had 800,000 valiant men who drew the sword. However, in the 1 Chronicles, chapter 21, verse 5, the number of men who drew the sword in Israel is given as 1,100,000. On the surface, this seems like a clear contradiction. How can the same event, the same count of men, differ so drastically in the same Holy Bible? To understand this, we need to delve deeper into the context and understand the purpose of the writers of these books. The books of Samuel and Chronicles were written by different authors for different purposes and at different times. The author of Samuel is providing a historical account, while the author of Chronicles is writing for a post-exilic community, reminding them of their past glory and God's faithfulness. We also need to consider the Hebrew language in which the Bible was originally written. In Hebrew, words can have various meanings depending on the context. The word Eleph, which is translated as thousand in English, can also mean troop or unit. So it is possible that the author of Samuel was counting individual warriors, while the author of Chronicles was counting military units. Moreover, the count in Chronicles could have included additional troops that were not included in the count in Samuel, like the royal guard or additional levies. This is not a contradiction, but a difference in the scope of the count. Remember, the Bible is not a single book, but a collection of books written by different authors in different contexts and for different audiences. What seems like contradictions are often differences in perspective, context, or interpretation. This is another example where understanding the context and purpose of the writer resolves the apparent contradiction. As we've seen, what may initially appear as contradictions in the Bible can often be resolved with context and interpretation and accurately studying the scriptures. Throughout our exploration, we've dissected 3 verses that at first glance seem to contradict each other. Yet, when we look deeper into the historical context, the original language, and the overall themes of the Bible, we found that these apparent contradictions were not contradictions at all. The first verse, as you may recall, seemed to contradict the very essence of God's omniscience. However, upon closer examination, we found that the contradiction was merely a result of linguistic differences between the original Hebrew text and its English translation. When we took a look at the original language and its historical context, it became clear that the verse was not questioning God's all-knowing power, but rather emphasizing human free will. Next, we scrutinized a verse that seemed to challenge the inaccuracy of Judas's death. Similarly, the accounts of Judas's death do not contradict one another when they are read as 2 accounts that work together to make for a fuller picture. Judas did indeed hang himself out of guilt and shame, but as his body hung there, his corpse did what corpses do. It began to decompose. A decaying corpse will bloat if left alone. Eventually, Judas's dead body fell from the rope or was cut down, and when it struck the ground, it burst open. A terrible end for the one who had betrayed the Jesus. Finally, we analyzed a verse in Samuel and Chronicles that seemed to contradict the actual count of men who drew the sword. This discrepancy involves the difference in who was included in each report. In the report in 2 Samuel, the number of men of valor who drew the sword was 800,000, but did not include the standing army of 288,000 described in 1 Chronicles 27, 1:15, or the 12,000 specifically attached to Jerusalem described in 2 Chronicles 1:14. Including these figures gives the grand total of 1,100,000 men of valor who composed the entire army of the men of Israel. Both calculations are correct according to the groups which were included and excluded from each report. In all these instances, what seemed to be contradictions were actually misunderstandings caused by cultural, linguistic, or historical gaps. These misunderstandings were clarified when we considered the broader context and purpose of the text. This is not to say that understanding the Bible is always an easy task. It's a complex book, written over thousands of years by different authors, in different languages, and in vastly different cultural contexts. It requires careful study, deep reflection, and an open mind. But as we've seen today, it's a task that can yield profound insights and deepen our understanding of the divine. Just remember, the Bible is not a book of contradictions, but a book of divine revelation. It's a book that invites us to wrestle with its text, to seek understanding and to find truth in its pages. So next time you come across what seems like a contradiction, remember to consider the context, the purpose of the writer, and the overall message of the Bible.